Hey John, you should be seeing the video now. We just waited to start until almost 6:30. We are about 1 minute early, but we should be ready to start here soon. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. I hope the storms that rolled through the area later last week didn't cause anyone's too many troubles. We had, it actually helped us. We had a dead tree that was standing and it topped the dead part, so I just need another storm to come and top a little bit more, and then I can actually drop the thing safely. But hopefully no one had any trees come down in any significant way. All right, so I think we are now ready to start. We just hit 6:30, so let me switch over. And if you're joining and you just joined and you didn't see the preview of what we were showing, we are tying the CK Baitfish tonight. And so the CK Baitfish looks like this, and it is it's a toss-up between this and maybe one other fly. That if I could only have one fly pattern for the rest of my life, it would be this. The other would probably be the smallmouth Dorito fly, which is currently on my hat and we tied in an earlier live stream just because that one's so much fun. But this thing is just deadly. It's deadly everywhere. You name it. If it's a predatory species that eats small fish, it's something you can go after. And if it goes after bigger fish, well, you can tie this in a larger size as well. And I know some people will tie this big enough for muskie. So this is in probably the most useful color, chartreuse, if it's not chartreuse, right? The size of this is really dictated by the tail. This is a size 1 tail. We'll get to that here in just a minute. And then hook size kind of fits that tail accordingly. This chartreuse color, this is absolutely killer for me in saltwater. This is my top producing saltwater fly, hands down. Jeff saying he knows it's available in a 6/0 size. Yes, the tails absolutely are. You can, I will tie one that size. I just haven't done it yet. Hi, John. Thanks for joining tonight. So we've got 2 of the Johns on for sure. Any other Johns that are watching that haven't said hi, hello as well. Hey, Stu, welcome. Like I said, this is my top producing saltwater pattern, hands down. If I'm going after, I think I put it in an email that I put out to everyone. I think I've got 5 species that my personal best on the fly has come from this pattern. Not always in this color, but most of them on this color. Now this particular fly right here, we're gonna switch over onto the other camera, and we're going to start looking when we start talking about our hook options for this fly. We're going to use this as a pattern. And the reason this is that this fly itself was tied by the creator of this pattern, Chuck Craft. And this actually came from Chuck's box. He and I were talking about hooks, and we were talking about some of the issues that I've had personally with hooks with this pattern. And he pulled this out of his box and said, well, this is what it's supposed to be tied on. And for the life of me, I don't actually know the true hook. But we'll talk about that here in just a minute, and we'll kind of tell that story. And we'll talk about how that can make a difference with your fly and what to look for if you don't have, the exact hook that this was meant to be tied on. So let's go through materials, and then we'll begin that hook discussion. By the way, if anyone has any questions at any time, feel free to throw them into the chat. We're here to help you guys, learn more through this. If you're watching this as a recording, you're not joining us live, thank you. But feel free to put a question in the comments if you have any. And we'll go through and look at those periodically and try to get you answers as quickly as possible. Okay, so the first material that we're going to need are going to be the tails themselves. So I've got a number of different colors, and black and white. White's great because you can use a Sharpie and make it any color you want. you know, I've got it in olive, orange, pink, you name it. You can tell that I dedicate a lot of my fly box real estate space to this fly. It's one of about a half a dozen patterns that I always like to have with me, and, you know, especially if I'm out on my boat and fishing, whether it be freshwater or salt. But these tails, the important part about it is that I'm getting them from the Eastern Trophies fly fishing, and the only reason why we bring that up, it's not necessarily to endorse them per se, but it's because this is the only pattern that I'm aware of where the dimensions of this tail are cut to the specifications that Chuck designed. And that's actually critical, and we'll talk about that when we talk to hook selection, about why you want to make sure, A, you're using the right tail, and there are some other tails that you can get out there, and if that's all you can find, that's all you can find. But I'll show you what you really need to be looking for, and then how you choose your hook for that tail selection. All right, so the next piece of material that we need is just a body fur. So there are, you generally are going to get this in two different types. You're going to get this in where it's already kind of cut, and there's, I'm going to switch over to the main camera. So you can see where we have one side here, that's where everything's tied together, and then everything's hanging off the end. Now the other type, and you'll see this is Chocklett's body wrap is what it's sometimes advertised as. This will come in what looks kind of like a big spool or a ball. So you'll have two braided sides together. This is actually the same material as what you saw before. It's just that someone's already cut it for you. So oftentimes for myself, I'll go ahead and I'll buy it as one big ball, and I'll do exactly what you've seen here. I'll go through and actually cut this material myself. It allows me to tie more flies, a little bit more cost effective. But if you're only going to tie a few of these, you know, I kind of recommend that you get the pre-cut material. The nice thing about the pre-cut material is that it's a little bit less costly, so if you only tie a few flies, this is definitely the way to go. Okay, so we've covered the tail, we've covered the body wrap. The next piece of material is optional, and that is using some type of weight. So I like to use lead-free round wire for my normal range size, which is the size 1 baitfish tail. I like to use 0.025 lead-free. Now, if you can't find lead-free, you can use regular lead wire. In fact, this fly here was tied when Chuck tied it with lead wire. And, you know, so the thing to remember about lead wire versus lead-free. So if you're like me and you don't like to use lead, you know, for many reasons, you go lead-free. Lead-free wire is lighter than actual lead. So if you see an older pattern that says use 0.15 or 0.02 lead wire, I recommend you go up at least a half size. So if you have 0.02 lead wire in a pattern, which is what you can use for the CK Baitfish, use a 0.025 lead-free wire, and then you should get a similar result. It'll never be exact, right? Because you're only going to exact if you literally tie it the same way that the fly designer tied it, but you'll be able to get similar performance, and so you'll have a similar weight. So you know, for this, just to recap, 0.02 lead wire or 0.025 lead-free wire, and that's optional if you want. I put it onto every single one of my baitfish, simply because I've had one or two float, but some people like to have them right at the surface, where they stay on the surface or just suspend just below the surface, and we'll specifically tie them in that way. Me, I like it to have this fly flutter down, and we'll talk about, actually let's talk about that right now when we actually fish this fly. The way this thing is designed is it is designed so that it is very water resistant in one direction, in the front here, and then everything else kind of slides through. So what that does is it will cause this fly to kick. So as you strip it into short strips, it will, so as the fish would see it, it'll actually kick off to the side, and it'll look wounded. The other thing that you can do then is, you strip it along, strip, and then you let it sit. And it'll actually just kind of flutter down, and it'll make it look as if it is a wounded bait fish. So it'll come, and then you just kind of let it sit. It's really deadly in moving water, because as it is coming down the water column and going this way and then kicks up, it really looks like a struggling wounded bait fish and kicks off that predatory instinct. So this is very similar to a fluke or a super fluke that bass fishermen will use. In fact, when Chuck developed this fly, that is what he was going after. He was trying to, come on, focus. So, come on, technical difficulties. All right, give me 1 second to fix this. There we go. Okay, that was better. Sorry about that, guys. No idea. I just decided to focus on me and not on the fly. So when Chuck actually designed this, he designed this to imitate, that type of fluke, that type of pattern. All right. So we talked about the tail. We've talked about the body wrap material, and now the final material before we get to the hook is super glue. And in this case, we like to use a gel super glue. So I like this Ultra Gel Control. You can use whatever super glue you'd like. The reason why the gel is nice is it is a little bit more forgiving. When we tie this fly, you'll see it when we get to it. If you don't have super glue tonight, it's fine. And you can go through and use the super glue afterwards. What we're going to do is we're actually going to glue, this is what the tail looks like before it goes on the fly. And we actually glue these tabs down. So you can get a practice with it, and then when you get super glue, you can go ahead and do that so that you can tie along with us tonight. All right, so I've put off the hook situation as long as I can. Now we need to talk about hooks. So almost everyone today, when you talk to them, will tell you that this fly is tied in a Gamakatsu B10s. However, I can tell you for a fact that this fly is not tied with a Gamakatsu B10s. It is actually tied with a type of mustad hook, which for the life of me, I cannot find anymore. It's an older mustad hook. I've looked in the current catalog of mustads, what they offer, and it's just not being offered. But the characteristics of this hook are very similar to that of a B10s. So what I mean by that is this pattern, because there is so much stiff material, it's a little squishy. It's actually what makes this fly so deadly too, because when the fish actually bites this, it's not just a feather. There's something tangible to bite into. It's what makes that fish hold on to this fly a little bit longer. But because of that, we need a wider hook gap. So we need a wide gap hook. The B10s is one of the most famous wide gap hooks that are out there. So this is here is a size 1 aught B10s hook. Now this is a size 1 tail. You'd be tempted to use a size 1 hook. However, if you do, you will notice that while the hook gap will be very close, you line this up. So the hook gap's very close, but the hook shank is too short. So Gamakatsu changed. You guys are getting a little bit of hook history here. I'm going to bore everyone a little bit if you're not interested in this. Gamakatsu changed their hook shank length on the B10s some number of years ago. When they did, before they did that, the hook used to be very similar to what you see here with this mustad. It was a great substitute. After they changed it, the B10s became shorter, so that if you tie a size 1 B10s hook, you will get something that looks similar to this fly. And what that does is shorten the overall body length, and it also makes it so that this tail, when it comes around, is more susceptible to getting caught into that hook. So I'm gonna switch over. So when you fish this and when you tie this, the only way that this is ever gonna get fouled is if the tail wraps around and sticks onto the hook. So the way we can avoid that, one is with SuperGlue. You can see my SuperGlue. This one actually is not glued on that one side. And the other thing is to make sure you're using a hook that is the right profile. So we can see on this one that when it comes around, you see how it almost comes to that tip, but not quite. That's how we know the tail placement's correct. And that's how we know that we got good proportion with the body length. So, easiest way that I know to fix this is to size up the B10s. So here's a B10s in a 2/0 that the hook shank is very, very close to the original hook. However, then our hook gap becomes much, much larger. Not the end of the world. Bass have massive mouths, so you can use a 2/0 or a 1/0. So either 1/0 or a 2/0 B10s on a size 1 CK Baitfish tail, and it will fish just fine. The other hook that you will hear people talk about is a Daiichi 2461. Now the beauty of this is that you don't get the massive hook gap, so less snags on the bottom, and you get that longer hook shank. So rather than using a 2/0, I can actually downsize this to a size 1, and I'll have that correct shaft length. But I have found that every CK Baitfish I have tied in the 2461 has it has simply failed to catch the fish. I have tons and tons of hits, tons and tons of hookups, and have landed almost none of them. In fact, very famously, some of you will remember, I was at one of our local ponds on an outing with Healing Waters and fishing, and I went 0 for 6. What Chuck said that he would do with the 2461 Daiichi is he would actually bend the eye of the hook down, and he would bend the gap of the hook slightly in order to help pin that fish. And again, this must add, that's the way that hook profile actually is. Now, this leads me into the hook that I personally use, and that is this hook. This was going to several fly shops, looking at all of their hooks, and I finally found one that matched that must add. This is a barbless hook. It has a pretty aggressive kind of a slant inward to help pin the fish, and this is made by a company called Firehole. So this is their Firehole 811, a little hard to see, and a size 1. So there you go. That is the long-standing, very, very long-winded story around hook selection for this fly. The TLDR is grab yourself a Gamakatsu 1/0 or 2/0. It should work just fine for using a size 1 baitfish tail. If you want to find a hook that matches exactly of what the original pattern, this one here, was tied on, the closest that I found are these Firehole hooks. All right, so the other fun thing is this can be tied in a multitude of different colors. So here we see black, very, very deadly. If I'm going in saltwater, I make sure I have two. I make sure I have a white and make sure I have a chartreuse. And then if I'm bass fishing, I like to make sure I'm carrying an olive as well. And especially in the springtime, you always need to make sure that you're carrying pink because for some reason it's pretty darn effective. All right, so let's get into it. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed a little bit of history of hook selection for this pattern. I'm going to tie on a 2/0 Gamakatsu because I do not currently have any 1/0s, but like we said, this will work just fine. So when we put this in, especially since this is a bigger hook, we want to make sure that, if it's a trout hook, a lot of times we're up at the very top of our jaws. Because this is a bigger hook, we're going to actually put it a little bit farther back into those jaws and a little bit closer to that bend of that hook. That's going to help hold this hook in a little bit more. Yeah, Jeff just made a great suggestion about swapping the tail color and the body color for this powder. So, John, you should have. So I know that I sent out an email. Hopefully, you received it. For a couple of you guys that are participants in the Charlottesville program, there were individual bags with all the materials needed for this fly over at the Orvis and Stonefield for you guys. So if you received that email, feel free to go in and grab one of those. But in the regular bag of materials that we handed you as well, there are some Gamakatsu B10s, but they're size 4. So they will be too small for the tails that, that you'll pick up. So hopefully you have the right hook. If not, just tie on, just tie along, tie on the largest hook that you have, and you'll be able to get a feel for how you go through and wrap the body on this fly. All right. So we have our hook in place. I always check, especially on these larger hooks, that if I can actually bend down the hook shank, then I know that it's tied in tight enough. So the next thing I need to do is I need to do thread. I forgot to mention thread. So I tend to tie lighter. Some people will tie in a 210. I tend to tie in a 140 denier. You may see it as a 3/0 instead of a G thread if you're tying with the other thread sizing. I start in about the middle of the hook shank and I work my way back. You know what? I was going to tie in thread because I thought it'd be a lot of fun, especially to have a little bit of a red hot spot in the end. But guys, I'm going to tie in orange just because that's going to show up on camera a little bit better. So thread color honestly doesn't matter that much. Chuck always tied in white, and then he would just use a Sharpie at the end to change the color of his thread. So I'm going to cut off my tag end. Now I'm going to actually wrap very similar to what we did with the clawdad. I'm going to start coming down maybe a quarter of the way of the hook shank, right? So of the hook bend, I'm sorry. So if the bend of our hook is right here is the halfway point, I'm going to come down about halfway to that. And what this is doing is giving me a thread base for SuperGlue to adhere to. And I'm going to go ahead and almost broke my thread there, all the way back up to kind of that tie-in point. I'm just somewhere in front of the hook point. So it's a great suggestion, Rick, about, Sharpies can bleed in water. They absolutely can. So nice to hear that the Primacolor marker, do a little bit better. So yeah, people are always playing with different colors and different markers to see what works better. All right, so we have our thread on. The next thing we need to do is go ahead and put in our tail. So I am going to tie this in chartreuse. And so this is a size 1 chartreuse tail. Now, the tails have 2 different orientations. We have it where the the gap and the tab that are in line with that gap can be on top, or we can have it down below. I personally don't think it matters. I know Chuck would probably argue that it has to be a very particular way. But the way that I tend to tie it on is I tend to tie to where the smaller tab, let me change my fingers, is on top, which allows me to bend down below. And then no, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. I actually prefer to do it this way. So you do it where the smaller is below, and then we'll end up folding around. Don't worry, I'm going to show you this here in a minute. The difference is whether or not your tail sits higher than the hook shank, or it'll sit lower than the hook shank. So if I do it the other way, you'll see that it's more in line with that hook shank. But I'm gonna do it. So the orientation that I'm gonna do is, let me hold it this way, where the tab, it's kind of on the small side, is facing towards the bottom, and then where there's kind of this shape here is angled onto the top. The next thing that we need to do is we need to prime to be able to actually tie this in. Now, if we see the orientation on this hook, let me hold it down here. What we want to do, like I said, so if I grab finish fly, so we want to make sure that when this tail comes around and these tabs here are going to be stiff, we want to make sure that this tail doesn't get stuck in that hook point. And so when we go ahead and tie this in, that makes a big difference. Because if we tie this too far forward, you see this tail will have plenty of opportunity, even on this oversized hook, to kind of fold around and get stuck. So we want to make sure that we're tying farther back. Now if we tie too far back, it'll just look a little weird. So I tend to try to have it so that where these gaps are, grab my, my bodkin, where these gaps are kind of in line with where this hook starts to bend down. So as long as it's somewhere, it doesn't need to be perfect, as long as it's somewhere in there, generally you're in a good position. So the other thing that we need to do is make sure that our wraps of wire are sitting pretty much where our thread is. So we want to make sure it's kind of just a little bit in front of that hook point is where we're going to have it and where it comes up, but not where it's crowding the hook eyes. So when you put wire in, the tails are actually too long in the forward facing, and so we'll actually come in and trim just a little bit off the front. So it kind of changes it to something like that. And so now where my thread is and where the tail is, they kind of meet pretty perfectly. So let me switch my hand around. So that's a tip to kind of help you out. Is even though these tails are very close, they're not perfect. So there's a little bit of trimming that we're going to do as we tie this fly in. All right, so now we're going to go ahead, and this is where we get to practice our origami. What we want to do is fold that small tab along the body. So you can kind of see, it's very difficult for me to show, but I kind of have it pinned behind my hand. So I'm going to go ahead, and that's just in front, and the entire tail is along the side of my hook shank. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold, and I'm going to try to show you this here in just a minute. I'm actually going to fold the back part around this hook. So I'm going to do something a little crazy that you should never do on your bench. I'm going to take the hook out while I am tying with no material actually properly attached. So you can see that on the back side, I've got that tab folded back along and kind of folded over. Really hard to show. Let me flip the hook over so you can kind of see, right? And that's kind of the way, yep, there you go. The way that it is. So we've got the tabs on both sides. There's a good angle. We want to make sure that those tabs become even. All right, so let me put my hook back in the vise and line everything back up. So I've got, put it back on, I'll show you, kind of line it up. I do the small tab, fold it along that body length. I do the large tab, get my finger out of the way, so the small tab's folded over, large tab folds right behind. And once I have that in place, I'm going to pinch hold. Don't worry if it's not perfect. And I'm just going to put 2-3 loose wraps, pull up, and then work my thread forward. So that just pins all of that material in place. So now I can better show you. See, I've folded that top down like, So we want to make sure that these tabs are even where they lay along the tail. So if I turn my orientation, you see these two tabs? They come to an even location folded, right? So there's one side, and then here is, oh this, I am not dexterous enough to do that. Here is the other. So that's what we're looking to do, Stu. So you can see that this tail immediately just kind of pops down. Don't worry about that. What we're going to do now is we're going to glue these tabs in place using that gel super glue. And so this is the reason why we only put in enough thread wraps to keep the tail in place. We have not wrapped back yet. So this gel super glue, what we're going to do is we're going to take the tab. This is the underside of the tab. This is the part that folds against the body of the fly. I'm going to put just a thin bead of super glue down it. I'm going to hope this shows up on camera. All right. It's not so much shown on camera. Almost. You can just barely see. It's a very thin bead. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fold this. Because it's the gel super glue, I've got lots of time. I'm going to kind of make sure that that goes right down the middle of that tail. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of push it into place. Try not to glue my fingers. And I've only done one tab. See, this other tab here hasn't been done yet. So now that I know that that's in place, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this tab. So I'm going to do it upside down so that you guys can better see. Again, I'm only putting super glue along this tab, nowhere else. Thin bead all the way down to the end. As that bead of super glue just barely shows up on camera. And then I'm going to go ahead and this time try to make sure that the two tabs are in the same position on the tail. So I need to reposition mine a little. This is the gel gives you a little bit of time to do this. And once you kind of have it in place, then you go ahead and press in. Now, I've got a little bit of my thread showing. I'm not worried about that. What it actually allowed me to do is to make sure that some of that super glue is locked in around that hook shank. That's going to help this tail to not want to bend forward even more. It's really going to help lock this tail in place and keep it from fouling our hook shank. All right. So we've got our super glue in place. Now we're ready to start wrapping back along the tail. I promise things are going to start moving more quickly here in just a minute. Getting this fly set up and getting this tail positioned correctly is one of the most critical things that you can do. Then after that, things get pretty smooth. So we're going to start wrapping backwards. Right? So we're going to do this one wrap kind of touching another. And what we're going to notice is that after a while, this tail is going to act like there's too much material. By the way, you can always grab it, twist it if you need to. But you can see here that I'm starting to get bunched up down below and up top. You'll actually see it more in person as you tie this. So the way to fix that, this is what Chuck had taught me, is to actually bring in your scissors and you kind of give it a little bit of a relief cut. You just kind of cut just up along. I'm going to flip the vise over so you guys can see this better, and especially on the bottom here. And this helps alleviate some of that bunching up. It's going to make the body of the body wrap material lay so much more cleanly. You wouldn't believe it, because I only shaved just a very small amount. But that makes a huge difference in this fly. So now we can go ahead and kind of keep wrapping back. And, you know, this is keeping this tail in orientation. It's not wanting to flop over to the side on me. And I can tie back to right at the end of the hook shank where it just starts to want coming down. That's where I'll go ahead and stop. So now this tail is never coming out of this fly. It is super secured in. It has super glue glued into the actual hook shank, and it has tons of thread wraps up above, and we're about to put even more tension on it. You're not going to have a fish come up and pull this tail off. This is also something called ultra suede. Never seen this tail rip. The only way I've ever had these flies fail is when I put them into a tree and I haven't been able to retrieve them, so I've had to break the line. I've never had these flies come apart on me. One of the most robust flies I've ever tied. All right, so we've got our thread back here, right at the end of that hook shank, right before where everything starts to kind of come down. So I'm going to grab my body wrap. And by the way, I like to keep the body wrap in the bag and only pull out as much as I need, so that, you know, I kind of keep it zipped. Kind of keeps it a little bit less crazy, but you know, feel free to do what you want. See, Chuck actually knew the exact length he needed. I think it was 11 inches for this particular fly, or 11 and a half inches. So he would have everything cut to length and he would just be able to do it perfect. I don't do that, so I just tie right out of the bag. So, all right. Now for this material, there are two sides, and this will not show up on camera, so I'm just going to explain it to you. One side is very bumpy along where all this material is tied in. The other side is smooth. Trust me, there's a difference. Sorry, I don't have a macro lens for my camera. The smooth side, we want wrapping around the hook shank, but we want, see, this orientation is backwards. See, all this material on the smooth side is pointing forward. Well, we actually want it oriented the other direction. See, we want it pointing backwards. So the next thing that I'll do, now that I know that I've got the smooth side of this material facing against the hook shank and the length of the material facing backwards, I'm going to come in and just cut a small amount off. This is going to give me a tie-in point. In some body wrap, you can get away with actually pulling these fibers and pulling them out, but unfortunately others, if you do that, this kind of thread here will fray out and you won't have a good tie-in point. So I just kind of trim it now and it works well for me. All right, so smooth side against the hook shank, where the material is wanting to face back towards the tail. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and, as always, pulling upwards, I'm going to go ahead and tie this material in place. So now I've got my body wrap in place, and I've got my thread back into the very front of where I had my tail tied in. Now I'm ready to go ahead and put in, so just saw in the comments, Jeff knew the exact length, 11.25 inches. Yes. Now mind you, that also was because he was tying on a very specific hook. So, you know, good luck, one, getting that amount of material around the hook. I've always tried, I've always failed. Chuck is able to tie so dense, it's ridiculous. I just do not have that ability. But yeah, so the other part about this, all right, so where was I? Got distracted, sorry guys. All right, we're ready to go ahead and put in our wire. So for me, when I tie in wire, and we want to tie where that wire is kind of right here, right where that tail is, there's a little ramp, a little bump, I will actually go forward a little bit with my thread. And I will purposefully put a little bit more than I need to wrap backwards. So you're going to see what that looks like here in just a second. So kind of pay attention and follow along as I do this. So I just put a couple of cross wraps in. That makes it so that that thread is held enough. And so now I can go ahead and start manipulating this backwards, and if I've done it right, it should end pretty close to that bump, and you can always slide and manipulate this if needed. The other thing I'll do is I'll grab a pair of pliers. Now you can use, if you don't have debarred pliers, we've talked about this before, you can use hackle pliers for this, but what I'm doing is flattening down this wire so that It doesn't really have a pointy end that can snag anything, and it's in place. All right, so now that I have that, that's about 2.5 wraps. I want to have about maybe 6 total wraps on this. That's my preference. So there's 3, that's 4, that's 5, that's 6. You can feel free to experiment with this. I generally find that that's enough. I might, in this case, do 7, even 8. So I'm usually somewhere between 6 and 8 wraps, depending on how quickly I want this to sink. We're going to do 7 for fun because I'm going to fish this on a 7-weight rod. So we haven't talked about that. This fly, I think you need a minimum of 6-weight in this size to cast, but it'll be tough on a 6-weight. 7-weight is golden, and then 8-weight works extremely well as well. Obviously, as you go up in weights, it becomes easier to throw the fly. But it is something that you are going to need a larger or heavier weight rod to cast. All right. So you saw there, I kind of pinched off that wire. It's even easier with lead. Lead-free is a little bit tougher. Use my D-bar pliers, flatten it back down. Now I'm going to go ahead and secure these with just some wraps forward and wraps back. I'm not doing these first few wraps very tight, because if I go real tight, the thread's just going to pop. I'll show you. Well, it won't now, but it would pop right through the wire. So by doing a couple loose wraps and doing them cross like this, forward and back, it actually gives me a base by which to put my thread on. And now that wire is not going to come loose. It's not going to move. When I go ahead and I put the body wrap around it, it's not going to separate on me. It's held right in place, right where I want on the hook shank. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my thread base all the way up to the hook eye. And I'm going to throw in a half hitch. So for speed on this, because this video is going to get a little bit long. This is a fly that takes a little while to tie. I'm going to go ahead and utilize the rotary function of my vise, which you're just barely going to be able to see on camera. And that allows me to rotate this fly now and put this material on. You can do this without a rotary vise, but I will tell you a rotary vise makes this so much easier. All right, so now we're ready to actually build the body of this fly, where we're going to be palmering. That's the technique where we're wrapping this material around the hook shank, palmering the material all the way around the fly, all the way up to the hook eye. Now, you might be tempted just to go ahead and wrap it on real quick. And if you were a guide and you weren't worried about it, you might do this and get it done pretty quickly. But as you can see, material's starting to get trapped. It's not necessarily the tightest on here. So if you want to do this to where you're going to get a fly that's going to fish better, then the key is to take your time and to try to comb these fibers out and together as you wrap around the hook. So I'll start, and I'm trying to get each successive wrap as close to the previous wrap as I can. I'm not necessarily wrapping on top of the previous one. I might do it slightly, but I'm just trying to have it where it's as close to the previous wrap as I can. I'll do maybe 3 or 4 wraps, and then I will grab one of the most useful tools that I have on my bench is a toothbrush. This is an old toothbrush, and I will use this to actually comb out the material. So what this is doing is helping to get any knots out. It's helping to make sure that you're not going to trap any material forward, and it allows you to get this material on very evenly. And I'll actually do this in different orientations. So this, I'll do it from the underside, I'll do it on left side, on the right side, on the top. I'll kind of alternate where I am brushing out, combing out this fly, and it makes it so that this material goes on so much more evenly. Now, Chuck had a metal dubbing brush, little comb, that was phenomenal. I don't know where he got it from. I know it was old. I asked him, and he said he got it many, many years ago. I haven't seen anything like it since. So, you know, if you can find something that is stiff but very narrow in the gaps you want, so you don't want to grab a comb that's too wide. So even my hair comb that I use for deer hair, it just want to get stuck a bunch. It just doesn't work for me. And this gap here is just too wide. So that's why I use the toothbrush. Allows me to go through, really helps. It doesn't get caught in the material, and really helps comb out this material. So, all right, now I'm going to do these next couple of wraps pretty quickly for sake of time. You could literally, you know, the neater you do this and the more time you take when you wrap this around, the better your fly is going to look at the end and the better it is going to swim and perform at the end, because you will have a much more densely packed body. So when Chuck, you can look at it, is very dense, and it makes it so that when the fish grab it, it feels more natural. It feels like it has a little bit of a squishy body to it. So it's important to take your time and to kind of do this correctly. So, but I'm gonna cheat a little bit and kind of go a little bit faster just so I can show you the trimming at the end. I'm going to try not to trap anything when I do it, but I don't want to take, you know, 20 minutes or whatever it may take me to wrap around. So do this about 4 times. I'm also making sure that as I wrap, and I'll show you here, I'm making sure there are no twists. So I'm making sure that this is always oriented correctly, so I'm not putting in twists in the body wrap. Hopefully that makes sense. But what I'm referring to here is, see this here, I'm making sure that I don't twist this, that it's going on in the same orientation as it wraps around that hook shank. All right, so that's good enough. And again, I usually comb this out so that everything gets uniform. I've actually unwound one of these flies after I've wrapped it on. I've unwrapped just to see what happens. And what ends up occurring, it's not felting, but it's similar process. All of these individual hairs end up interlocking in together. And that's really what felting is where you'll have actual hair that will just mat together and it'll form like a new type of material. So these actually interlock together, and that's what makes that body so much more uniform. Versus, you know, just a feather where, you know, well, feathers have the ability to kind of naturally do this if you look at it on a microscopic level, but when we wrap on like a woolly bugger or something, you know, those operate independently. All right, so we're just gonna wrap forward just a little bit more for sake of time. All right. Oh, I really got a mess. All right, take just a minute to fix this a little bit. Just so it'll trim a little bit nicer for you guys. See, I'm gonna flip on the underside and comb out the underside. Making sure that I'm not just combing the same orientation every time. I wanna make sure that I'm really trying to get this thing organized as I lay it on. It'll make my life so much easier when I go to actually trim this fly. So still coming forward. And we'll brush this out. Trying to go a little bit faster for you guys. We're getting closer to this hook eye. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. All right, there's a mess. wash that quickly. And see, this has gotten twisted on me, so I'm taking the time to untwist it to orient it correctly around this hook shank. Okay, now that this is untwisted, I can keep wrapping forward. We're going to wrap this right on up. So let me comb this out and then I'll explain how I finish this fly. Because I think this makes a big difference too. I really want to make sure that I've got a dense front end on this fly, because that's what is going to make it so that the water kicks around it, and that's what gives this fly all of its action. Now, again, typically I've got a lot more material than what I even have here on this fly. It's more densely packed and it's combed out a little bit better, but for the sake of time, you know, I'm just trying to show you how this is done. All right, so I have it so that this material, of course, my hook is a little loose. That's the danger of pulling it out to show you guys some things on camera. Let me reorient a little bit and kind of bring it up. I have the material where it's just on the back of that hook eye, and I'll actually do about another wrap or half wrap over top of itself. So this puts more material than what should be up in the front, helps me to get a denser packed front. And so then I'll start taking my thread. Now I'm going to wind my thread back up a little bit because I had it wrapped out a little bit because of using the rotary feature. And I'm going to go ahead and start trapping this material by wrapping the thread back slightly. I'm only going to do this about 2 times. It just helps me to ease a little bit of the tension off of this main line here. And then what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do my best to show you guys on camera, is I am going to, so I have a little bit trapped. I'm going to cut some of this material so that I have a tie-in point. And I'm going to find my scissors to do that with. And I'm going to be really careful not to cut my thread. So I've just kind of trimmed. You'll see that here in just a minute when I actually pull that material away. And now I have a actual tie-in point. So I'm going to wrap that around my hook so that I can put thread behind and in front. I'm going to explain that here again in just a second. So I cut a little bit of material away and then I wrapped a little bit around, because when I cut the material away, it wasn't right against the hook shank. So by wrapping maybe a half turn, it put that gap that I created against the hook shank, and it allowed me then to wrap very cleanly behind and in front. And I always do at least 2, where I will go behind the material, and then I'll pull the material back, and I'll do in front of the material. Again, this is not quite as clean as I'd usually like it. I'm going to just kind of push the material back. I can get away with that because it's not very densely packed in there. And now I can go ahead and start wrapping forward. So I've done at least 2 wraps, one behind, one in front, and one behind, one in front. So I can cut off this body wrap and finally get it out of my way. By the way, I've got my thread with my finger here, and I am pushing that away as I cut the body wrap so that I don't cut my thread. And now I'm ready to wrap backwards. So I'm going to grab all of this material, pull it back, and start bringing my thread backwards. Now I'm going to be able to come farther back on this fly than normal. But you can see, you know, on Chuck's original, there's quite a distance. It's almost like a full hook eye that he's wrapped back. And that's what gives you a really good front end to this fly that you can make pretty stiff so that it pushes water out of the way. All right, so all I'm doing now is I'm wrapping enough times around to kind of clean up, make a little cone. I don't want to go too much on this, but I do need it to be a little bit cleaner so that things are trapped. And now I'm going to have my thread right against the material, and that's where I'm going to whip finish. So let's go ahead and whip this in. 1, 2, 3 turns. And I'm going to do another 3-turn whip. 1, 2, 3 turns. There, that's nice and locked in place. So I can go ahead and cut my thread off. All right, so I do not recommend going out and trying to fish this fly as is, because you'll probably need a 10 or a 12 weight, and it is going to hold water like nothing else. In fact, if I comb this out, I get this really cool giant marshmallow. And so what we need to do is we have to trim this thing down to size. And the size of your marshmallow is going to depend. You know, if I had tied it with a spink material, it wouldn't be quite as tall just because these fibers aren't as long. Obviously on this green, these are very, very long fibers. So there's lots of material to trim. And this gets messy. So I'm going to bring over my little waist catcher. You guys can't see that. A little thing to help the fly bench. And now I'm going to take a minute and I'm just kind of teasing all of the fibers perpendicular to the hook. I want them straight up because that's going to allow me to trim everything a little bit more evenly when I go to trim it. So how do we trim a circle? Well, this gets fun. Yes, it does look like a pufferfish stew. A mustache comb. Sorry, I'm catching up on some of the comments now. Okay, so I will start looking for some mustache combs. Who told me it was a dubbing comb? Or maybe I misheard. But yeah, mustache comb makes sense. That actually might work quite well. What we are going to do to cut a circle, we are going to cut a square. Yep, and that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But what we are going to do is, see, in order to get this shape, we're going to cut a square, and then we're going to be able to cut the corners off of that square. It is easier to, it's easier for a person to cut a square or close to a square than it is for them to cut a circular shape. And so as we trim this, we're just going to trim it as easy as we can. Now, the scissors that I like to use as long as I can. If you can find some that these aren't serrated, well, these have a light serration to them, but a serrated scissor is even better. So the search continues, Jeff. I have never seen anything like what Chuck used to comb this out. But I will say I've tied many of these flies and the toothbrush works just fine. So, you know, feel free to use an old toothbrush. I recommend it. It has my thumbs up. So I like to have as long as I can so I can cut down this body as far as I can. And then I like to have a light serration or a full serration if you can, because it'll grab this material better. So when I go to cut this, let me orient this so that, because the camera is actually looking down, I am trying to cut at a slight angle coming back. I want this fly to have a tapered look. So you see how this fly here kind of is fatter at the top and gets thinner and closer to the hook shank towards the back? That's the look we're trying to do. Now, if you want to just start and just cut straight back, feel free to do so. And then you can work on that taper afterwards. But I'm going to taper it a little bit from the beginning. So I'm going to cut just a big cut from the top, being very mindful not to cut my tail. Then I'm going to work on the bottom. Do the same. Be very mindful of your scissors here, not to cut the hook shank. In fact, I'm not worried about cutting all the way back. I'm just cutting to that hook shank. And I'll go ahead and get that material out of the way. So now we got something crazy, right? A little bit thinner here, real wide, a little bit thinner. So now we can go through and just cut our sides. And I'm just kind of cutting back towards that hook shank. I'm actually not cutting all the way back because I don't want to cut my tail. See this material here? Whoops, 1 second. It'll be and we have returned. So, all right, so I actually just cut back to the hook shank, leave this alone, but we're gonna trim that towards the end. So now I just have a mohawk left on the side, and I'm gonna go ahead and cut that. So if I had a better camera setup for you guys, I would be able to show this angle here where it's coming right down. But what I'm looking for, and I'm going to trim it, and then I'll show you, is just trying to get this as box-like as possible. So I'm actually looking, I don't know if you guys will be able to see this or not. So I'm actually looking, if the fly were here, right down as I trim this. Oftentimes Chuck would actually pull this fly out of the vise and he would just trim it in his hand. For me, it's easier to trim it in the vise. Feel free to experiment, whatever works best for you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and just trim this a little bit, and then I'm gonna show you. You can kind of watch what I'm doing. But then I'll show you kind of how closely I've trimmed it. And notice, I'm not cutting all the way back. I'm only cutting back to where we tied in. Just trying to get it as even as I can. All right, so that's not bad. So if I pull this out of the vise, make it so you guys can actually see. See how it's kind of that square, that box? It doesn't have to be perfect, but that's kind of how it looks. And then I have a slight taper. I'm going to build that taper more here in just a minute. So yeah, people are, some trim outside the vise, some trim in the vise. I like it in the vise. I use the rotary feature. It just works well for me. I think I'm in the minority. I think most people actually trim this out of the vise, but it's just my preference. So now what I'm going to do is I'll show you this. So we have the box, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to trim the corners off. So I'm going to cut along here and along each of these corners. And what that results in is something that looks pretty circular. So by making 4 straight cuts and then 4 more straight cuts, we kind of cut out a circle, and it's close enough for our purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and trim one corner off. I'm just doing these straight cuts. 2 corners, I need to trim the top a little bit more. Three corners. Trim my side back just a bit. 4. So, and there's going to be a lot more trimming that's going to happen here in just a minute, but what I want to show you is that by just kind of doing those straight cuts, I now have something that looks far more circular. Now this is too fluffy than what I want in the end. I want to trim this a lot closer, but I now have a guide to which I can utilize. So now what I'll do is I'll just kind of come in and I'll just start walking the fly around my vise. See, this is why I like to keep it in the vise on a rotary, because it allows me to kind of just pretty quickly trim this. Again, I'm not worried about the tail yet. I'm more worried about the front. kind of cut this through. These scissors are starting to get a little more dull on me. And I'm trying to trim this down. Now, this is also personal preference for many different people. Some people like a thicker bodied baitfish. They will have it where this is a lot fluffier. Chuck's, well, you can see his. So you can see right now how thick mine is. Put his in front, this is a lot thinner. He really tapered it down so that the back of this was about the same width as that tail end. So, I mean, he really trimmed it down, and he himself admitted, you know, he would take his time and really make sure it was trimmed right, because, I mean, they're so durable that as long as you didn't lose that fly in the, you know, snagging on the bottom if you're using like a sinking line, or more importantly in a tree, I mean, that fly is always going to stay with you. So you might as well trim it correctly. Take your time when you do it, because you don't need a ton of these, because it's not like it's going to wear out on fish. I mean, I've caught hundreds of fish on CK Baitfish, and they look just like they did after I mean, they're a little discolored, but they look very similar to like it was when I just took it off the vise, as far as the overall shape. So very, very durable pattern. All right. So I have jammed my finger on that hook for you guys like 3 times tonight. That is a very, very sharp hook, I can attest. All right. So I think I just did it a 4th or a 5th time. All right, that's fun. So you can see that shape is really coming along for us. I'm going to leave it that thickness. And now I'm going to start working on the tail end. So I've purposely kind of left this, it's kind of got like a little hula skirt at the end. I'm going to go ahead and, you can see this material actually ends there. So all of this fluffy stuff, I don't have anything, if I trim real tight, it's gone, right? And so you get something that looks like this fly, where it's trimmed right against that end of that hook. See, I trimmed that too tightly. What you really want is something that has this kind of nice tapered look at the end. So we're going to achieve that by being really careful when we go to trim the tail end of this fly. So I'm going to grab my trusty toothbrush. I'm going to start combing this material out to make sure everything is oriented correctly, make sure everything's wrapped around not wrapped around the hook. All right, so after I've done that, I'm going to come back in. Now I'm really cutting at an angle, using the front part as a guide. See, that's why I trimmed this first, because now I can use it as a guide. I'm being careful not to cut the tail. Use it as a guide, get that angle, and start cutting down. We'll do one complete kind of pass around, and then what we'll do, a little more carefully this time so I don't hook myself. So I'll go ahead and I'll start combing out some of this. Now these are really long fibers. Yours, when you tie this, may not be quite this long. So you may not have the same problem that I have. So I'm actually going to trim these a little bit shorter. But I'll show you how I do that. So you can see here I've got kind of this bump right here along the tail, right in front of the hook shank. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start trimming that. I like to have this gap as free as I can to make it easier to hook fish. And so now I'm going to come back in, still working on trimming with that angle as a guide. Kind of trim back and trim along. I'm going to brush this out. Still looking to make sure that I've got everything kind of trapped the way I want. All right. That's looking pretty good. Excuse me. I'm going to do a little bit more up top. I noticed that section wasn't quite trimmed the way I want it to. And so now what I'm going to do is when I have it roll long like this, I will actually switch over, and believe it or not, I will use curved scissors. And then I will take the tail and I will bend the tail out of the way slightly, and I will come in and try to like naturally taper down and curve in that material. Try to make it a little bit shorter. And I'll even do that up on the back, just really trying to make this material taper down. So you can see the difference, right? This is untrimmed and that's trimmed. Now that's looking a lot more tapered down. So I'm gonna do the same thing over here. I'm actually gonna grab the tail, pull that tail down, come in with my scissors, and I'm not just cutting into it, I'm kind of working my way where I'm kind of feathering it, tapering it, so it looks a little bit more natural. It's not just like it just ends, but that it actually kind of transitions into that tail material. Kind of work my way back right along the body, taking a little bit of the bulk out. And now we try to make sure that everything is even. So I need to take just a little bit more off back here. Taking small amounts off. Less is more. I can take a little bit off and then I can take a little bit off. But if I take a bunch at once, I can't put it back on. I would not recommend trying to glue this material back in place. So every once in a while, it is worth to comb everything back out. This material, you'd be surprised how much can get trapped underneath. I'm going to show you another trick here in just a minute. I'm just going to trim this tail again one more time, and then we'll call it good for tonight as far as trimming the tail. So by doing that, I now notice I've got some long fibers. They kind of wrapped around the hook and hiding in a couple of places. So I'm going to come back in, trim those out, working our way around. Again, being mindful not to actually cut the tail. If we need to move it out of the way, we move it out of the way. And looking at it to make sure it's even. It's pretty even. So you can see now that we have a much more tapered fly. I still want to go back and retrim the body. So if I brush against, so we laid everything in where it's coming back. So now I'm brushing forward. It's going to tease those fibers back out. Hang on one second. Let me actually get this fly secured in this vise better. So I'm going to come through and I'm really getting down deep and picking these fibers out. We're going to start seeing all kinds of stuff picking out. So now I'm being mindful because if I go too far into the back of the tail, it's going to stick up real far and I'm going to cut. All that work I just did on my tail will be for naught. So I'm only combing in the front part of the body. And now we'll see just how uneven those trims were. So you can see this is far more frazzled now. So now I can come back in. I'm going to use my straight scissors and do kind of pretty much what we did before, right? I'm actually going to cut another little box out, right along, come back in, cut the edges. Now I'm just going to kind of follow the fly, really help trim it, and comb back that tail just a bit, come back in, make sure that is a nice smooth, even transition back into the tail. So that's how I trim. It'll be, usually I'll do that maybe 2-3 times where I'll come in, kind of tease the fibers out, see if there are any that, are real long that I had trapped, and then I'll come back in and kind of just trim it back down. And eventually, you'll have it where pretty much all the fibers are the same length. And I really do feel that that swims a lot better, looks a lot better in the water, looks, you know, far more natural, gives it a ton more action because, you know, we really have something that, you know, is less water resistant up front, more water resistant in the front, less water resistant as it comes down along the sides, helps this fly kick out sideways, have lots of really crazy action, makes this thing look incredibly lifelike and like it's a dying fish. So the last thing that I want to do, this is optional, but I prefer to do it, is to make the front end more robust and to build in a little bit of a front cone. So to do that, I'll actually pop a fly vertical. So actually you guys can look down, right? You can see it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. And so, yeah, take care, John. Now what I will do is, I forgot to put this in the materials list. You can use SuperGlue if you want, but I actually prefer to use some high gloss head cement. And I'll actually grab my bodkin, put this along the thread. Now my little thread cone here is a little bit thicker than usual, just because of putting the wraps around so quickly for you guys. So usually this is a little bit thinner up front, but I'm still going to fish this fly. Don't worry about that. And it's going to catch fish. So I'll put enough head cement to make sure it's going to wrap into those thread wraps, and then I'll grab a nice big gob and I kind of start brushing it along the front and brushing it back. What this does is creates a very stiff front end. It'll actually make it a little bit more cone-like in the front as well. And I'll do this all the way around the fly. This really helps this fly kick more. So again, this is an optional step, but I think it adds to the durability to the thread, and I think it makes the action of this fly that much better. So I would highly recommend it. And I don't think I put the head cement in the materials list, so sorry about that, guys. You know, this is something you can always add later on. This isn't something that if you don't have it tonight, don't worry about it. You can fix it later on. And so I'm actually pushing that material back, give me that little cone shaped profile, and the result, take it out, is something that has a little bit of that tapered shape in the front. So you could epoxy the entire body. I wouldn't recommend doing it, Stu. And the reason is that if you end up epoxying the whole body, you're going to trap a ton of hair in there potentially, or not hair, a bunch of air inside, and this will end up floating a lot more. So this will absorb water. It makes this fly a lot heavier when you're going to cast it, but it also allows it to become more neutrally buoyant. Neutral buoyancy is, what we mean by that is where the fly will, when you pause it, especially in like still water on a lake, it'll just kind of sit still, or it'll just slowly, which is what I like, start to drift down. And that's why we put that weight in it. So if you epoxy the whole body, it's going to make it super heavy, so it might just either sink like a stone, or if you trap a bunch of air where the epoxy is only on the outside, it'll float, and then it won't really sink down. Because what we want is this thing to kind of be like, and it's just dying, right? It kind of drifts down, darts back up, drifts down, because it'll be a little bit nose heavy because of the epoxy that we put on the front. So it kind of gives that kind of dying action as it goes along. So I wouldn't recommend epoxying the whole body. If you want to try it, hey, you know, experimentation is what it's about. But yeah, so that's really it, guys. I could have spent a lot more time on trimming this fly, But, you know, this is something that I'll do usually. Hey, I'll have the TV on in the background, have a movie on, something like that. Tie up 1 or 2 of these, and it's a fly that can remain in my fly box until I finally wrap it around that tree and have to break the line. So it's just not going to come apart on me. Fantastic, utterly fantastic fly for saltwater, for freshwater, for our rivers. I can tell you, I have been absolutely having a blast on our local river here in Charlottesville, fishing this fly. So, okay, yeah, so Stu asked a question about floating line with this fly. So, I fish this fly with 2 different types of lines, either a sinking line or a floating line, and I do that for very specific reasons. If I am in saltwater, I almost exclusively fish with sinking. So, okay, so Stu meant with sinking line. So in saltwater, I almost exclusively fish this fly with sinking line. And the reason for that is usually my saltwater depths are a lot deeper than in the river system. So in the rivers where I fish here in Charlottesville, my water column usually is only a few feet max. And usually the fish, you know, they'll easily come up and hit the surface. Saltwater fish tend to be suspended a little bit more, not always. Hey, you can go out, you know, starting around this time of year actually, and definitely more into the fall. You can go out and just chase birds and hit stripers on the surface. But you can still hit stripers on the surface with a sinking line. But a lot of times I need to get down in depth more. So I will cast this fly out and I will let the sinking line sink. So if I know that I'm in like 5 or 10 or 15 feet of water, I may wait, depending upon the weight of my line, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds. So fishing in the Legends of the Fly tournament, you know, when I would do that, or when I would have guys out on my boat that I was guiding, I would say, let that fly sit for 20 seconds after you've casted it. And that really is bringing it down, because we had a school of bait fish suspended about 10 feet, and then we had fish below that, so I needed that fly down at the 15-foot mark. And then once, you know, we waited that 20, 30 seconds, that fly line is now down. My fly may still actually be pulled down, but my fly line is down at the depth I want. Now I start stripping, and that's going to bring that fly, every time that you strip your line, you will actually, even on a sinking line, start bringing it back up towards the surface. If you strip a sinking line fast enough, you can keep a fly just under the surface. But it allows you to have that fly at a targeted depth. The other reason why I always fish sinking almost exclusively in saltwater with this pattern is, for me, and for the fishing that I've done for saltwater, fish tend to be a little bit more aggressive, where I want the fly moving a lot faster. You will actually see some guys, 1 second. Some guys will take, let me get my chair out of here. So they'll cast out, and then they will actually tuck the fly rod under, and then they'll use 2 hands to strip. Or you just do really aggressive, very quick strips. I usually just do the 1. I have done the double occasionally, but usually I can just do real long strips, but very, very quickly. So if I've casted this out, let it sit, you know, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, depending on the depth I want to get to. And now I'll start stripping pretty quickly. And depending, sometimes you do want to fish, you know, a little bit slower, but it's usually a little bit longer pull. Like I'll do strip, strip, pause, strip, 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 pause, something like that. Put this rod away. But because I'm stripping more aggressively and more quickly, that tends to have that fly more up at the surface. If I was fishing floating line, that fly is just going to be skipping right along the surface. Now that might be exactly what you want to do, but for me, if I'm trying to stay down deeper, it's not going to work. So that's why saltwater, I'm always fishing sinking. You can cast to, so if fish are busting the surface, you tend to want to get a little bit under the surface anyway. and you want to make that fly look like it is trying to get out of there. So again, sinking line allows you to strip really quickly, even when you're fishing on the surface. Now the fly is just under the surface and it's moving a lot faster versus just skimming across the top of the surface. And to me, it just is a better presentation. In my rivers, I almost never use a sinking line. I'm always using a floating line because I'm usually fishing slower. So versus those quick strips in saltwater, in freshwater, I'm usually casting out. I'm usually doing like a strip, pause, right? Especially if it's in a river system. So now as the fly is coming in, you know, it's kind of sinking down, and as the current's moving this way, bringing that fly down, stripping across, bringing it down. And I'm fishing this. So if this is my river orientation, right, and it's flowing this direction to this direction, I will actually cast usually parallel with me, or maybe slightly upstream or slightly downstream. But when I finish, it's usually back behind me. So I'm actually swinging that fly, stripping in and swinging it across. Some people will actually cast it and dead drift it. So that it just looks like, you know, something caught in the current, it's died, and it's just floating along as well. So hopefully that answers your question. You learned a little bit about casting this. I will give a little bit of prelude. It's something that I'm working on. It's one of the reasons why we took a break in the summer and aren't doing things weekly. I am going to try, especially with this fly, but a couple other flies, to have a video that we're going to pre-film on the water to kind of show you, hey, this is where we're casting, this is how we're reading the water, and actually, if I can pull it off, I'll show you some underwater footage of that fly and how it goes along. So stay tuned. We haven't filmed it yet. The rivers got blown out by those storms. I have to let them come back down. They got to get clear so that we can get this footage for you guys. But we are working on that, hopefully sometime this month, and have that where we can watch that together one evening, and we can kind of talk through it, and you know, you guys can learn, hey, this is what these flies are supposed to look like in the water, at least from our opinion. So with that, if there are no more questions, you guys have a great night. This was a longer video than normal, but this fly takes a little bit longer than normal. Thank you guys for sticking with me, and I really hope that you learned something, and I really, really hope that you guys give this a go, because it takes a while. I'll admit it took me a while to figure out how to tie this well. I had the benefit of having Chuck personally teach me how to tie these flies. I was very lucky in that regard. Hopefully I was able to pass some of that knowledge on to you guys. And it took me a little bit to figure it out on the water. But now that I have, it's almost what I call a cheater fly. If I throw it on, especially, you know, if I'm fishing for smallmouth, you know, especially in the summertime, I just know I can catch a fish. In saltwater, this is it. This is my searching fly. And I've caught so many striper. I've caught countless speckled trout on this. A big bull redfish. I know John left us, but I knew he was going after some reds. I definitely had one that was 30 plus inches. Turn and start chasing. Unfortunately, didn't get it to hit. On one of these flies, slightly different coloration. So last thing I'll leave you with is, by the way, you can do some fun stuff. So as an example, as I was wrapping this around, I actually colored in a red band. So this is a saltwater variation of this fly. It's a little bit scraggly because I've used it. And it's kind of what these flies start looking like after you've used them. They get a little unkempt, but still plenty fishable. So yeah. That, guys, take care, and I will see you the next time. We're still figuring out. We're going to stick with the second and fourth week this month. Like I said, September we're going to reevaluate and see if we can bring more content more quickly, or just keep this format. Feel free to give us feedback as well. Let us know if this is working for you guys. You know, we are here for you. So if and then we'll take it from there. So take